Today's featured recipe from the Fanny Farmer kitchen cabinet is a New England classic, Boston brown bread. If you've had Boston brown bread before, it probably came in a can. We're going to try making it fresh. You will need rye flour, cornmeal, whole wheat flour, baking soda, salt, molasses, milk. Let's get started. First, we're going to sift our dry ingredients together. Cornmeal, whole wheat flour, and rye flour. The mixture of the three flours is probably an indication of how old the recipe is. The early English settlers, in order to stretch their precious wheat flour, would add the cheaper rye flour and the locally grown cornmeal. Next, some baking soda and salt. The flours I'm using were all from grain grown in Massachusetts and stone ground at the Plymouth Grist Mill in Plymouth, Massachusetts. Not entirely historically accurate for 1914, but what the heck, I think it's pretty cool. Now for our wet ingredients. Molasses. A little tip to make your molasses easier to pour, just grease your measuring container beforehand. And milk. Fanny Farmer says you can use 2 cups of sour milk or 1 3/4 cups of sweet milk or even water. I didn't have any sour milk to hand, so I'm using sweet or what we would call regular milk. And then we stir until well mixed. Next, we're heading into the kitchen. Fanny Farmer made her Boston brown bread in cylindrical tin molds with lids. She also said you could use 1-pound baking powder pans. I don't have either of those things, so I'm going to be using a ceramic pudding basin. It needs to be treated a little bit differently, and it's not going to make a beautiful cylinder. Another hallmark of Boston brown bread, besides the 3 flours, is that it is steamed rather than baked. This comes from a time when it was not common to have access to an oven. So we're going to put the bread batter into a well-buttered pudding mold. Fanny Farmer specifically says that the batter should only fill the mold 2/3. I think we're doing okay. Since I don't have a lid for my pudding basin, I'm going to be using a pudding cloth, in this case, a flour sack towel. Fanny Farmer says to butter the lids of the molds really well. I actually just smeared butter on the flour sack towel and used it to grease the inside of the basin. We're going to take our pudding string, which is a piece of cotton kitchen string, and tie it around the cloth just below the lip of the basin. I'm using a slipped reef knot, which is like a square knot with an extra loop. Makes it easier to untie the wet string. Tie 2 opposite corners of your cloth together and the other 2 corners. And now you have a sturdy handle with which to lift your basin if you were going to be lowering it into boiling water. I have a slightly different method. I use a pasta insert. I just put my pudding in the insert and then put that into my boiling water. I want the boiling water to come up just to about below the lip of the basin, so about 3/4 of the way up. You can't just leave it alone and come back in 3.5 hours. You do have to check on it every now and then because the water does boil down. So I keep a kettle at the ready to replenish the boiling water. See you back here. We are halfway through the steaming. I'm gonna add a little more water. Be careful when you're topping off your water that you're using boiling water as not to lower the temperature, and that you don't pour it all over your bread. All right, that looks better. It is time. The bread has been steaming for 3.5 hours. It's very hot. Untie the cloth, remove the pudding string, remove the cloth, Boston brown bread. We'll just let this cool a little bit. Can you see how it's steaming? And then we'll give it a try. Well, here we are. Boston brown bread from Fannie Farmer's 1914 recipe. It's so pretty. I hate to cut into it, but I'm going to. Just cut a little bit off the top to give it a taste. It's very good. It's not really very sweet, despite the molasses. Chewy. I can definitely taste the cornmeal and the rye. It's a little gritty. That may just be the coarseness of the flours I used. I like it. I'd make it again. But how does it compare to commercially made brown bread, the kind that comes in a can? Fortunately, I have some. It was actually really hard to find Boston brown bread. I don't understand why. I live in Boston, but I couldn't find it at any supermarket I went to. Fortunately, Ava Fox went on an epic quest, which ended with a can of brown bread for me. All right, the biggest difference right off the bat is the commercial bread is much moister. It's sweeter. This is actually the kind with raisins in it, so that's not surprising. It's much softer. It tastes very strongly of molasses. It doesn't have the sort of earthy heft of my homemade brown bread. So which one did I like better? They are different enough that it's really hard to judge that way. I think they're both good. I would serve the commercial Boston brown bread at any tea party I had with a little cream cheese. The homemade brown bread is heartier. Like I said, I think that's the flours I used, but it would be a really good accompaniment to just about any kind of hearty main dish, a chowder, a stew. I would have thought that it would be much easier to just go out and buy a can of Boston brown bread if you had a hankering for it. But as I've discovered, the cans are hard to come by right now. So, as it turns out, making your own is actually fairly easy. It only has a few ingredients. They go together very quickly. The only challenge is that you have to be able to set aside 3.5 hours to steam the bread. But if you've got that, definitely give it a try. Thank you so much for watching, and happy cooking.